The unspeakable horrors inflicted upon millions of blacks, men, women, children, captured from their ancestral homelands and forced onto the decks of notorious slave ships, stands among the darkest crimes ever committed in the history of mankind.
You're talking about hundreds of people. You're at 120 degrees. It smells terrible. There are actually people dying around you, which has to be a traumatic experience for everybody on board.
For more than 3 centuries, 1525 to 1866, 12.5 million blacks were whisked from their homes and forcibly transported across the Atlantic. A journey that over 2 million of them would not survive. By the turn of the 18th century, Europeans were building ships capable of transporting hundreds of enslaved people per journey. These ships had extra potholes for ventilation, weapons mounted on deck in case of rebellion, and additional compartments added below deck to take on more human cargo. Once moved below deck, enslaved people would find themselves stuffed into compartments with ceilings as low as 4.5 feet, where they would spend most of their voyage, across the Middle Passage.
We've learned a great deal about the Middle Passage in the last 40 years or so. The volume of the trade involved the removal of about 12.5 million people from the African continent. The Middle Passage was the middle leg of a voyage that starts in Europe. The first passage is from Europe to Africa. The Middle Passage is the journey from Africa to America. And then the third passage is the journey back from America to Europe.
The Middle Passage could take anywhere from 2 to 3 months. Men and women were separated. Men typically were held in the lower belly of the ship. The roof, if you would, was quite low, probably about 4 feet high. So people couldn't stand. African men were shackled together and they were packed so closely together in a spoon-like position. And they would stay like that for pretty much the entire journey.
It was a system sustained by the sickness of greed and the want to control. A system that reshaped continents and placed black generations on hold.
Historians have a hard time capturing what the Middle Passage must have felt like for enslaved men and women. It's a voyage that is deeply disorienting. It's a voyage to a place that you can't anticipate. You don't know what's going to happen to you. I don't think we have adequate words to capture that experience.
But what happened after those slave ships reached their destination, after the captives were sold and the vessels began their long journey back across the Atlantic? That is the chapter of this history we are about to confront. Before we continue, kindly take a moment to join our community on WhatsApp, where Black truths are told without censoring. The link is waiting at the comment section below. Now to the story.
People in the Americas knew when a ship arrived because they could smell it. If the wind was blowing from offshore, people would know that for sure. Maybe a day before it came. It would be sort of like a septic tank coming towards you. That's what it would smell like.
Slave ships smelled beyond foul, smelled of every human shame possible. The seriously festering wounds of captives, vomits, urine and litters of feces everywhere, alongside hundreds of sweating bodies packed together, and the increasing dead amongst them yet to be thrown out. By merely perceiving their smell from afar in the said era, people easily recognized it was some slave ship coming through. Historians, left with no choice, began calling these vessels floating tombs. You sure know what a tomb means, don't you? This was how acrid, deathly slave ships were. Talk more how much insane and unearthly it was for black captives. As many as 6 million Africans were transported against their will across the Atlantic between the 16th and 19th centuries. The vast majority of them, around 42%, were sent to the Caribbean, while 38% were sent to Brazil and around 5% to North America. This was a huge journey. While the passage from Angola to Brazil could be done within 35 days, sailing from the west coast of Africa to North America required traveling more than 4,000 miles over the rough Atlantic. In the 16th and 17th centuries, this journey was mainly done by Portuguese ships, with the one-way passage taking 3 or sometimes 4 months, depending on the weather conditions. By the 18th century, the slave trade had grown to become a major business. This meant that bigger ships were being used, and these were much faster than the vessels that had previously been used. For the captains, time was money. Being at sea for more days than was necessary meant that it was more likely some of his human cargo would die, cutting his profits. As many as 600 enslaved Africans were crammed into ships, packed like sardines in the hull, enduring horrific conditions. The slave trade was a business, albeit a supremely cruel one. Slaves were seen as little more than cargo by the owners of the slave ships, so, quite simply, the more they carried, the more money they stood to earn. This meant that most slave ships were not only packed to capacity, they were packed way beyond capacity. Overcrowding was commonplace, and for many years during the height of the transatlantic slave trade, there was simply nothing stopping the owners of the ships from setting sail with as many slaves as they could carry, both above and below deck. The majority of slaves were kept below deck in cramped, inhumane conditions. As the chilling blueprints of ships revealed, slaves were often chained lying down, side by side on the floor. This meant hundreds could be laid side by side and head to toe. These unfortunate men and women had no more than a few inches to move. Some lucky ones might be able to sit up, but most were forced to lie down for almost entirely the 2-month journey. In the best recorded cases, an individual would get a space around 4 feet wide and 5 high. Suffice to say, there were no proper toilet facilities. The slaves were simply left in their own filth and hosed down occasionally up on deck. Disease was rife below deck, and slaves who died increased by the moment. They would be there for days, sometimes weeks, before they were finally thrown off the ship. The cramped conditions below deck were not just uncomfortable and dehumanizing for the slaves. It was so deadly that ship captains tried to stay as far away from the slaves' quarters as possible, leaving the lowest members of the crew to look after them. Mortality among the captives was staggering. On some voyages, up to 20% of enslaved Africans died before reaching land and their bodies thrown into the Atlantic. Sharks had begun following slave ships as a matter of instinct. Sailors recorded how the predators shadowed the vessels for weeks, knowing that death would inevitably feed them. Death by dysentery was so common for slaves that it even had its own name among the crews, who began calling it the flux. This was caused by the unsanitary conditions below deck, especially by the lack of proper toilet facilities. Almost as serious was smallpox. Again, the cramped conditions meant that a single case could spread rapidly, killing dozens of slaves and even crew members. In bad weather, crews kept slaves below the deck for days at a time, for fear of losing any of their human cargo overboard. This placed them at heightened risk of contracting the pox or any other disease passing through the slaves. The records from the slave trade show that, up until the 1750s, around 1 in 5 of the African slaves being carried on these ships died mid-journey. By 1800, this ratio had fallen to around 1 in 18, a significant improvement. This was due mainly to the British and French, who, towards the end of the 18th century, passed laws aimed at improving conditions on the slave ships. One such law required ships to have a surgeon on board to look after the slaves' health. In many cases, these were men with little or no medical training or knowledge, and they could be extremely cruel themselves. Nevertheless, they were paid head money to keep their charges alive, and the greed, rather than the compassion or skills of the surgeons, meant many more slaves made it across the Atlantic. Punishment was severe on slaves in the ship, as crews were extremely violent to ensure that the rebellious ones amongst them got the language. One of the most common forms of punishments used on board the slave ships was subjecting a man, woman, or even a child to the thumbscrews. This simple but brutally effective method saw the victim's thumbs, fingers, or toes placed into a crude vise and slowly but steadily crushed. The pain was intense, especially if sharp points were embedded in the vide to add to the agony. By the year 1800, these had become a quintessential tool of the slave trade. Indeed, so widespread was their use that Thomas Clarkson, an English abolitionist and a leading campaigner against the slave trade, would carry a pair of thumbscrews with him at all times. He would use these, as well as other small instruments of torture, to illustrate the cruelty of the trade and to win support for his cause. Crude whips and other instruments for flogging were also used to maintain discipline in slave shops. In 1827, the revered Robert Walsh joined the British Navy in patrolling the waters of the Atlantic in search of ships breaking the law that had by then made the slave trade illegal. He noted with horror the way in which the slaves on the ship were kept down. He wrote, "Over the hatchway stood a ferocious-looking fellow with a scourge of many twisted thongs in his hand, who was the slave driver of the ship, and whenever he heard the slightest noise below, he shook it over them and seemed eager to exercise it." Reverend Walsh confiscated the whip and kept it for himself, not as a sick memento, but rather as a symbol of the unquestionable cruelty of the slave trade. By the time the ships turned around, the crew themselves were often sick, exhausted, and haunted. Yet, even on the return voyage, traces of brutality remained. Sometimes enslaved Africans were still on board. Not all captives were sold immediately. Some were kept to be traded at other ports in the Caribbean or North America. Others were taken as personal servants by the captain or officers. A few were children kept alive because they were easier to control. For those unlucky individuals, the return voyage meant continued imprisonment at sea. Imagine the terror of a young captive who had survived the Middle Passage only to remain trapped on the same ship that had carried so many others to death. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. There was nowhere to run, no land to swim toward, only the creaking wood of the vessel and the endless horizon of water. Even the crew feared the ships themselves. Slave ships had a reputation among sailors as cursed vessels. Too many deaths had occurred within their walls. Too many screams had echoed through their hulls during storms and disease outbreaks. Some sailors refused to sign contracts for voyages on slave ships after witnessing the Middle Passage once. Others drank heavily during the return journey, trying to drown memories that refused to leave them. At night, the ships creaked and groaned as they cut through the Atlantic swells. Chains knocked softly against wooden beams. The wind whistled through the rigging, and somewhere in the darkness of the ocean below, sharks still followed. When the ship finally reached European ports such as Liverpool, Bristol, or Nantes, merchants celebrated the arrival of valuable cargo: barrels of sugar, bales of cotton, crates of tobacco. Few people in those port cities saw the ghostly history hidden inside the ship's hull. They saw wealth. They saw commerce. They saw the expansion of the empire. What they did not see were the thousands of lives that had made that cargo possible. By the time a slave ship completed its return voyage, it had crossed the Atlantic 3 times, once to Africa, once to the Americas with enslaved captives, and once back to Europe with plantation goods. Each leg of the journey was soaked in human suffering. Historians estimate that more than 12 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic during the transatlantic slave trade. Nearly 2 million died during the Middle Passage alone. Their bodies became part of the ocean floor. The return voyages carried the wealth created from their forced labor, helping build the economies of European powers such as Britain, Portugal, Spain, and France. Entire cities grew rich from this system, but the ships themselves were silent witnesses. Their wooden beams absorbed the screams of the enslaved. Their iron shackles held the weight of human despair. And when the ships turned back across the Atlantic, carrying the products of slavery to European markets, they carried something else as well, the lingering echoes of the millions whose lives had been shattered within their walls. Slave ships recruited their crews from the most desperate in society, and it showed. The crews could be cruel, but they were often desperate too. The slave trade was a cruel business, and, as you might expect, working conditions were extremely tough. This meant that it attracted the very lowest rank of sailors, and many only signed up to work on a slave ship out of sheer desperation, or because they were coerced into it, for example, because they owed money and worked to pay off their debts. Sailors who had been in prison and who could find no other work also ended up crewing slave ships, and many of these had a propensity to violence they would put to good use on the long journey across the Atlantic. It would be wrong to compare the experiences of slaves and crew members, but compared to crew on other ships, those working on slave ships had a very rough deal indeed. Since the hull of a slave ship was filled with as many slaves as possible, crew were usually forced to sleep on deck. This left them open to the elements, either storms and rain and cold winds, or long hours of harsh sunlight. Disease was common among the crew, with many succumbing to malaria or yellow fever. What's more, crew would often be attacked by revolting slaves and usually killed in the most violent way imaginable. Or if they failed in their duties, sailors could be flogged themselves and might even be beaten to death should their negligence lead to the captain losing one or more slaves. Indeed, the records show that around a fifth of all crew members died along the way. Even those who made it to the Americas without dying or disease or being beaten to death by rebelling slaves were still vulnerable. Some captains were rumored to throw their crew overboard or poison them in order to avoid paying them when they landed back in Europe. Others simply refused to pay up at all, cheating their crews out of their wages. On numerous occasions, slaves managed to break free of their chains and take control of a ship. Instances of revolt were actually quite commonplace, especially while the ships were out at sea. According to some estimates, as many as 15 to 20% of all of the ships which left Africa with slaves on board never made it to the clients awaiting them in the New World. Though they might have had the upper hand, the slave ships' crews were always outnumbered. What's more, many of the slaves were chosen for their youth and physical strength. Many had, after all, been captured warriors. And so, if a fight did break out, the crews could soon find themselves in serious trouble. This was certainly the case in October of 1841. Then, the Creole, which was carrying around 135 African slaves from Richmond, Virginia to New Orleans, was taken over. Led by Madison Washington, a slave who had previously escaped, but who had been recaptured when he went looking for his enslaved wife, a group of 14 men managed to escape their shackles, picked up makeshift weapons, and took control of the ship. Some of the crew were killed in the bloody fighting, though others were allowed to live. The captain took over as captain and sailed the ship into British territory. Since by that point the British Empire had outlawed slavery, once they arrived, they were immediately granted their freedom. There are countless other instances of slaves revolting and taking control of the slave ships, though many stories have been lost to history. In 1764, for example, a ship belonging to the New London Company and under the command of a certain Captain George Faggett was anchored off the coast of Senegal for the night. It had just picked up African slaves from Goree Island, and the captain was waiting for first light to start his Atlantic crossing. Under the cover of darkness, however, some of the slaves managed to free themselves and, using nothing more than planks of wood, attacked the captain and his crew, earning their freedom. The freed slaves abandoned the ship and made their own way to shore. Furthermore, abuse and exploitation was rife, especially the sexual abuse of women. Captains of ships are generally known to prevent their crew from being intimate with the slaves. However, this was mainly for reasons of discipline among the crew than out of any concern for the slaves' well-being. In some cases, women slaves would come ashore in America carrying the children of the crew members who had raped them. However, while brutal rapes and other forms of abuse were only too common aboard the slave ships, so too were small acts of resistance. Many female slaves fought back against their abusers, while some performed abortion and infanticide as small acts of resistance. Others used sex to their advantage, offering favors to crew members in return for better treatment and extra freedom, sometimes using this freedom to help the male slaves rise up and revolt. Indeed, according to some histories of the Middle Passage, women were instrumental in organizing many slave ship uprisings. Let us remember the struggles of these enslaved individuals, our ancestors whose blood flowed through the cracks of those ships and their unbroken spirit that refused to be silenced. Their stories deserve to be told and remembered. That brings us to the end of another video. Join our community on WhatsApp to continue the conversation, and together, let us amplify their voices. Links in the description. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.